I cannot imagine how any business, how they can think of themselves to be sitting outside society. Everything that we do is integrated with the social, the political, the cultural in some form or the other. Externalizing costs is doing business.
Right.
Now, but there are implications of that, right? There are people who suffer from that. And so therefore, for anybody to sort of, in a sense, use that as an excuse seems to me either to be extremely naive or deliberately ignorant, right? As being part of privileged institutions and being continuing to be a part of privileged institutions, do you reinforce those privileges? You're participating in that sense in structures that you know are problematic. Then how do you deal with that? What do you do?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Raahi Impact Journeys. My name is Girish, and I am incredibly excited to be back with Professor Ankur Sarin today. It was exactly 2 years ago that we had done the first episode of Raahi with Professor Sarin. And incidentally, I was back here in the IIM Ahmedabad campus, and so I thought that we could do this short special episode. To catch up with Professor Sarin on how things have been and pick up some threads that we could not get to in the last episode, which was classrooms, boardrooms, and social impact that you can watch on Raahi. So, sir, welcome back to Raahi after a time when the name was not even ready. So, how have things been? How have you been?
Welcome back, Girish. I should be the one welcoming you back to campus, so welcome back to the campus. How have things been? So I was just recounting to somebody that being an academician in the same institute almost feels like if you've seen this movie Groundhog Day, where the same day repeats itself every single day. It's a little bit like that, it's the same cycle that keeps repeating.
So wait, when we spoke last time, what we had spoken about, like I was recounting, was we spoke about your journey as an academician. This couple of areas where you, couple of research that you've done, like the one on drug abuse, that children, and we spoke about the sense of social responsibility that you need to carry and how institutions like IIM Ahmedabad can evolve towards building more social sector leaders. So this is a span of things that we covered, if I put it broadly. I just wanted to check if what of the things that we spoke about are things that people came back and like, hey, I heard about this. This was interesting what you said. What resonated, or did any feedback come back to you?
I guess, one thing that a student at IIMA himself spoke about was this question about what is a social business? I mean, are there businesses that are sort of work on on society in some sense, and those that don't? And I think I had said something like every business, in a sense, is
has its
no business has doesn't have a social impact. Right. And it looks like that, at least to some people, maybe generated some ideas or thoughts. I think I'm more convinced about that. I'm not less convinced about that. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if the rest of the world is more convinced about that. In the world that I live in, I cannot imagine how any business, individual, entity, whatever you want to see the unit of analysis, how they can think of themselves to be sitting outside society. Everything that we do is integrated with the social, the political, the cultural in some form or the other. So this idea that some organizations are social organizations and others aren't is something that I cannot understand. And I think we've, in some ways, a lot of things have become more evident as well. organizations that you felt were quote unquote technology organizations, right, who were just doing technology, such a neutral thing to be doing. We saw how they responded when political power in the US, for instance, changed. Now, that doesn't just happen because
It's not an anomaly, or it is not.
Exactly. You're not, that shows that you're not sitting in a vacuum, right? Today, there's a newspaper article on in terms of sort of trusts and where different political electoral trusts, that how after the, declaring the electoral bonds to be illegal, now these trusts have become a whole lot more active. And the complete imbalance in terms of where funds go. It, between the political parties and then being able to trace it back to business organizations. Now, isn't that a very as hard evidence as we can find about sort of saying, hey, business is not politically neutral, right? So for me, I still struggle to understand why people would want to see businesses as something that sit outside society, as outside politics and outside culture.
Actually, that was the one thing that I took away from our conversation as well. Of the top things that I then started hearing myself repeat while talking to people, it was that. It was the point that you made, what you said, right? That every business has a social and environmental impact. And the question is, what is that impact? Sometimes what I've also heard is that they say, what can businesses do? Isn't it in the hands of the government? Isn't it externalities and oh, poor businesses? What would you say to that?
I mean, sure. I mean, what comes to be counted as an externality is in large part determined by the government, but the government doesn't operate independent of business. And so businesses have a fair say and influence in terms of what comes to be counted as an internalized cost versus what comes to be seen as an externalized cost, right? And I guess from the perspective of private profits, you would always want costs to be externalized. And if businesses see them as their role as merely pursuing profits, more and more costs would want them to be seen as externalized, right? And surely businesses work on that, and they pursue that. So that's doing business. Externalizing costs is doing business.
Right.
Now, but there are implications of that, right? There are people who suffer from that. And so therefore, for anybody to sort of, in a sense, use that as an excuse seems to me either to be extremely naive or deliberately ignorant, right? So, I mean, I don't see any other way of trying to understand this.
Yeah.
And I think the problem that I find in terms of the larger discourse and this sort of disassociation with them seeing themselves as a social, entity, is trying to seek the power of neutrality, as if that we are neutral entities. We are just, generating income. We are just generating sort of jobs. Yeah, sure, you're doing all of that. But in the process, what are the inequalities that you are creating, right? What are the social harms that you are that your work is leading to? Are you cognizant of that? And why shouldn't you be cognizant of that? Right? You are a social being. If you claim as from a legal perspective you are a legal person, well, you may be a legal person, but you're also a social being. So you've got to own up to that responsibility. Right? So I think there is this flattening out which occurs in places such as ours, and I think that my sort of developing these views is in some ways a reaction to that. Right? That okay, businesses are just about pursuit of profits. If you are working in a business, then you're just about the pursuit of profits, as an individual. And I think that's a incredible flattening out of human beings to start with, right? Human beings are not unidimensional entities. We all know that. We all are constituted by so many different emotions, objectives. This flattening out is what then in turn leads to many of these problems that I think at one level there's also a greater recognition about.
And just to also share a little bit of context where we're coming from, we were just discussing before this about how some of the courses that happen on campus, which talk about like the socio-cultural environment of business and things like that, we were just speaking about how sometimes students do not see where the line is drawn, where they feel like, oh, I am ultimately going to work in a company, so why do I need to be thinking about social problem? I'm not going to work for a non-profit after all. That's not, I'm not going after social impact. And I think it is at the heart of that is this assumption which comes saying that ultimately, if I work for a Nestle or an Amazon or for, again, top of mind examples, or a Blinkit, these are not in any way social enterprises or socially impactful, positive or negative enterprises. And I connected to this, there was just one more like hair I wanted to split, which was this point that I've been reflecting on, which is I keep, especially on this, I describe Raahi as a social impact video podcast also. But I find that I realize the word social change is perhaps a better, more a better word to use, or a more correct word to use in social impact, because ultimately what everyone is trying to do is to change society in a certain way. And then the question becomes, is it going in the direction that you think it should? Like that is more in line with the vision of the world you want to see in some sense. So
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're trying to change consumption patterns, I mean, just sticking also to what businesses also do, you are trying to change society, right? You're trying to change what comes to be consumed, what therefore comes to be produced, how it comes to be consumed, at what price. You're constantly changing society. Likewise, there are some organizations which take on an explicit purpose of changing society in specific directions, attached to questions of maybe social justice or attached to questions around equity. So that might lead them to pick a sector like education to work on, or that might lead them to work on a sector like health. But I think these are different paths. But ultimately, yes, everybody is engaged in trying to, some form of societal change, as you're describing.
and if we can just make it real, I want to go back to some of the corporate examples that we had discussed about. So 10 years ago, 10 years plus, I had taken a course under Professor Sarin called Investigating Corporate Social Irresponsibility, which he set upfront context saying, look, I'm not saying corporates are all bad, but explicitly in this course, we will talk about all the things that have been missteps so that we can have a deeper understanding of what the problems also are as you step into the world of corporates. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but that was the course that we had. There was a lot I learned in that. So if some of those examples you could share.
I mean, there's one example that I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand myself as I was trying to teach that course, right? Was an example of a pharmaceutical firm that had come out with this blockbuster life-saving drug, a cancer life-saving drug, and actually was using its CSR to sabotage. I mean, I'm sort of just trying to summarize things very quickly, but was using its CSR initiative to sabotage access to this drug. It'll take more time to flesh it out, but essentially the drug could be, could be manufactured, and there was sort of an intellectual property rights battle over it as well. And the courts ruled in favor or against this pharmaceutical giant. But then in the process of trying to maintain its monopoly rents over this drug, which was clearly life-saving, it was actually using its own CSR initiative. Now, I thought that was, an example of a sort of a very obscene non-market strategy. And in fact, I'm using the word non-market strategy very deliberately because I picked this up in sort of, a business journal where they were valorizing such kind of non-market strategies that businesses should be thinking about.
To pad their bottom line or to strengthen the business.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Nice.
And I thought, I mean, I thought that was vulgar, right? It was, I mean, I can't imagine how anybody could valorize action such as this, right? And so cases like that are what we point to, right? Where where businesses are quite aware. It's not a question of ignorance, right? They're aware, but they deliberately participate in activities that cause irreparable social harm. And the point, I mean, the reason, why for that course, when I taught it, we take that perspective, at least as far as I'm concerned, was business is just too big to be ignored. We talk about, well, it's the government's responsibility, but then you look at the size of business today, and you look at the size of governments in many countries and all of that, right? This is just, we cannot ignore the influence that businesses have on society.
And ultimately, it becomes a point around power structures. While you can say that X is responsible, ultimately, even if you say that government is responsible for this, so then what can corporates do? Ultimately, if corporates, like you say, are big and have the muscle, they can influence the policies that happen and are put in place. Yeah.
And I think what, it seems obvious to me, but I mean, I think businesses, once they start realizing or sort of acknowledging their own part in all of this, they will automatically also perhaps stop being diverted in that fight and instead see the harms that society and sort of these failures lead for themselves as well, right? The creation of weak institutions, which then makes it, in the sense of doing business, means you not need to participate in corruption, right? You need to participate in these activities which you might not have otherwise wanted to. But then what's the role that you have played in strengthening these institutions? When you, as a business, donate to political parties in such an imbalanced way, do you actually promote stronger institutions, or do you end up promoting weaker institutions, right? If you keep talking about externalization of, well, we got to do business and therefore there will be pollution, but that's an externality. Well, your employees and your managers and your CEO also is breathing that air. You can't escape that. So I think these are things that, as educators in a business school, it's our responsibility as well to be getting students to think about. It's not about propagating a particular ideology. It's not about like saying therefore business is bad or business is good. It's about saying, well, what are the roles and responsibilities you're going to be taking up, and what should you be cognizant about, right? It's about a more complete education. That's really how I see it.
Yeah. And I do think that we should maybe separate out, when you keep saying corporate should, is it about the individual who, like, should we separate out the employee of the corporate and what the corporate as an institution does? Because many times these choices are perhaps driven by a system and the incentives that a system provides, but even within that there is agency of the actors
Right.
within that system to do the little that they can.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair to say?
I think both, right? I mean, at an education institution, we have to take responsibility in some ways of trying to shape both elements. We are educating individuals, but there's I mean, that's why we're called institutions. We are we are educating a large number of individuals day in, day out, and we are in some ways shaping the larger systems as well. So what are the incentive structures that come to be? I think institutions like ours have a role there, but we also have a role in terms of sort of getting individuals to make better choices or more informed choices about, and recognize spaces perhaps that might be there even in limited settings, but where they can act, and where, and what should drive that decision making in that space.
That's fair. I think from the course, the one example that was very eye-opening, and I think because pop culture wise all of us know about it, like the Holocaust is something that everyone knows about. What I remember being very deeply hit by was this point that comes up in the course, which is the fact that Auschwitz, which is one of the most infamous concentration camps that was there, was funded by Deutsche Bank, and IBM was providing the punch cards they were providing the system by which you could manage, because at the end of the day, a concentration camp becomes a massive operations job. And so to help them manage those operations of these people, the punch in, punch out that sentries, etc., needed to do was technology provided by IBM, and Watson kept traveling quite a bit during that time. So,
yeah. And unfortunately, you find some of, I mean, not with the same companies, but with different companies, you find that replicated right in the genocide
Exactly.
in at Gaza, right? And so you then, I mean, the good part is this got called out very quickly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's because people who had done those earlier studies about IBM's and Deutsche Bank's sort of participation in the Holocaust then, I think led to a lot of people being aware.
Yeah.
And so when this activity happened, it was called out, and there was protests even within the organization.
Yeah.
Right. And I think those are, so while we can feel, and I think we should feel depressed about the participation of these large entities, in these activities, we should also perhaps recognize the fact that individuals stood up within these organizations and said that, no, this is not right.
Yeah. And I remember in the Auschwitz example, I remember you saying, or it was either you or Professor Navdeep who was saying this, that at the end of the day, for that loan to build Auschwitz to be passed in Deutsche Bank, there were employees who signed and passed on the papers. And that stayed with me deeply. This point that at the end of the day, when these things happen, there are people who are making daily choices which lead to that. You are just a cog in a much larger wheel, but ultimately you're helping the wheel move forward. And that has led me to this question of responsible privilege. I think one of those, what is this podcast about when it comes to that? A lot of times I boil it down to centrally, it's about responsible privilege. All of us, because I'm speaking in English, because of the sort of people that I end up reaching on YouTube, it ends up being people who have a certain amount of privilege in some way, shape, or form. And the question is, how do we deal with the privilege? And so I went down the rabbit hole of understanding that a little bit more. Interestingly, there is some amount of, little bit of reading that you can find on it, saying there are some people who are innovators who decide to they decide that they cannot fight the power hierarchy completely and go against it. But sitting within the system, they try to improve it to the extent that they can.
Yeah, I mean, first thing, Girish, thanks for sharing, what stayed with you. We don't typically get that feedback, right? We go into the classroom, we try to engage, but we don't get to know what stayed. So, that you're here back for your, I guess the 10-year reunion, and these things that stayed with you, I think is in some ways encouraging or gratifying that, okay, look, somebody's listening. So I'm grateful for that. But I think, likewise, being a faculty member at an institution like ours is a privilege. And the same dilemmas that sort of you guys would face as, once you've graduated from here, working with organizations and career choices, etc., we also face very similar dilemmas, right? Because there's plenty that can be also earned with that privilege, plenty that, ways that the privilege can be leveraged in multiple different directions, right? So the same dilemmas confront us, and we have to make choices ourselves in terms of what we do with it. I think it's, there is always this question of, as being part of privileged institutions and being continuing to be a part of privileged institutions, do you reinforce those privileges, right? Because you're participating in that sense in structures that are problematic. Then how do you deal with that? What do you do? And I think there's no really good answer in the sense of saying, there's no way for us to feel good about it. Whether you take the system, the caste as an institution, and with the privileges that I have had on account of my caste background, right? That has to be acknowledged, and there is no good way of sort of saying, well, I can do this and I can do that to make it, ameliorate the exploitation that occurs on the name of caste. I struggle with the same question, and the one thing that I keep trying to tell myself is I have to remain, I have to carry a whole lot of humility. So the more privileged we are, the more humility we have in terms of to at least be open to the prospect of learning, right? To be open to the essential task of listening, and it doesn't change the fact that in a classroom where you are a much more privileged entity and with a lot more power in the classroom, and you are, for instance, are leading a discussion on caste. It doesn't change the fact that there are people out there on the other side, the student side, who have actually experienced the violence of caste, right? So it doesn't, but at the same time, it's my responsibility, and maybe the best I can do with that privilege is to make sure that I listen to that person, right? So yeah, I don't think I'm giving you a very good answer, but it's a dilemma that I think we have an obligation to deal with it.
Yeah. And I also know that you are connected with or work with many different non-profits and organizations, because your name keeps coming up when I'm interacting with people. So do you want to share a little bit about the things that you do beyond the classroom?
I mean, the social sector is a space that I've tried to engage and support in whatever way and form that I can. So whether it be through collaborations in terms of research, writing reports or working on questions that emerge from the sector, rather than seeing the sector as just a space for data collection, which is what I think a lot of us academicians end up doing, right? But trying to be conscious about the fact that, look, the sector is an alternate space or a different space, and we should try to preserve the character of that space. Philanthropy, being driven by motivations that are sort of not driven by pecuniary sort of monetary motivations, but others, right? The idea of a civic association. I think I've always felt a need to try to preserve that space. So I've tried to participate in those ways, whether it being in the form of research with organizations, or being a part of advisory bodies, to whatever extent that I can contribute towards them, making better decisions, or in whatever way I can. So with a range of organizations, I've been on that, either on the advisory boards or in their sort of statutory boards, or, as I said, the place that I thought I could bring in some of the research skills and analytical thinking that I've learned to do, I've tried to contribute in those ways.
Any anecdotes or memorable organizations that you found are doing good work that you appreciate? Anything if you want to call out?
I mean, I don't like to pick out
Absolutely
organizations. I mean, I think we all these are all organizations that they try to do the best they can with resources that are limited. There are better and there are not as good. But one of the experiences that I quite enjoyed was there's still this continuing project we've done with a consortium of organizations called which come under this umbrella called RCRC, which began as an initiative during COVID of trying to organizations working in the livelihood space, working in rural areas, and after being engaged in COVID relief activities in some form or the other, they continue to form this stay together, keep this alliance together. And one of the activities they've taken up was trying to say that, look, as civil society organizations, as quote-unquote practitioners, can we also be engaged in some form of research?
Interesting. Okay.
What I found attractive, and the reason why I supported that, was I don't like this binary of sort of saying, hey, you are an expert in research, and therefore you should come and tell us, in terms of
set
knowledge.
Up the hypothesis, tell us what should be researched.
Or sort of knowledge resides with you and practice resides here, right? I mean, this segregation and this differentiation is not something that I subscribe to. And so the idea was that can we get organizations that are engaged in the practice space also think about what it means to be generating knowledge and using it, whether for their own strategy or in terms of advocacy for with local government the local government, etc. Right? So, can we demystify research, and can we bring it closer to people who could actually use the knowledge that comes out of it? And I think that's the kind of work that I feel sort of most closest to, because I'm not saying all research has to have practical relevance. There is good research that needs to be done, which is purely conceptual, theoretical, all of that. But if you are trying to engage with practice, this long form of sort of saying, okay, look, at some time somebody will adopt it, etc., etc. It's a very long cycle, and there has to be attempts to shorten that cycle as well, because it's beneficial both for practice and both for people like us who are trying to understand society. But what we were trying to also then do was, the questions that we were putting into the survey, once we got some results from the survey in terms of just the quantitative, we had meetings with these organizations, people who had done the data collection, some of the folk who had done the data collection, so that they got to know what data what the data they collected was translating to, but also to work with them in terms of interpreting it. Otherwise, whenever we write a report with quantitative data, it's our interpretations.
Yeah.
Right?
Interesting.
But we wanted to create a process where they would also be involved.
That's cool. That's nice.
But not an easy task.
So that's it. I actually really just wanted to, because it's been 2 years, and I remember when I asked you for can we do this recording, you were just like, yeah, sure. I mean, and you were very giving of your time and of the opportunity, and you were like, I just hope what you're doing takes off. So I do want to say thank you, and I want to I've done a few episodes since and have met some very interesting people. I asked you last time, the closing question was, if a genie came to you and gave you 3 wishes, what would you wish for? I'm not going to ask you for 3 more wishes, but if you just center back on that frame of reference, if there is one thing you wish every person listening in or viewing does, what would that be? And it can be more than one.
In terms of action, I would probably say have a conversation with somebody who carries views which are very different than yours, right? And what worries me is, in some ways, the poles that we have taken and we are wanting to stick on to, right? Because that kills conversations, that kills dialogue. And I'm not saying that therefore we can't distinguish between one position being better than the other, but I think at the end of the day we owe it to each other to have a respectful, polite conversation and engage with each other. I mean, that's what being a human is all about. So I would sort of if the genie were to come back, right, I would say, can we unfreeze ourselves a bit in terms of what positions we are very strongly holding on to, and at least give us some space to rethink, rediscover, be curious, right? I think that's what I would. And I think I've seen some of the conversations that you've had with others, and I think they helped there, right? I think the guests that the other folk that you've spoken to really speak in ways that are reasonable, logical, and get us to think about from multiple perspectives. So, good job.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the point that you made around polarization, by the way, it came up last time as well. You did like the word polarization did come up, interestingly. So it's been playing in your mind.
Still remains.
And to that, I think if you're watching or listening, please do take the time out to have those conversations. But how do you begin? How do you begin to have that conversation? Is it, for me, my answer would be when someone says something that you don't like, ask why. Why do you say that? What's driving that? What would be your answer?
I think, I mean, the why part comes in because there's an attitude of sort of saying, I want to learn more, right? That's where you ask the why.
Yeah.
And I think if we start from that position where we change our attitude towards saying, look, I need to learn more and I want to learn more, then the path would emerge. But I think that first change has to be a attitudinal change,
Yeah.
which begins with saying, I need to learn, I need to understand more. The world is a complex space. These issues that we are talking about are fairly complex, and I need to understand more. That curiosity and that humility, that attitude would then, I think, lead to different paths.
I would add two more elements to the mix. I was just reflecting. One is getting off your phones. So, because I was thinking of all the conversations that have fundamentally changed my thinking or like gnawed away at me until one day it suddenly made sense and I found myself seeing where they were coming from. They were often in bus rides or train rides, or because it was when you both have no option but to spend time with each other.
Right.
And you might as well make conversation and then turn on the curiosity button. So when we recorded the last conversation, it was before the name Raahi Impact Journeys had even been set. So if you go back and watch that video, I just begin with, hi, hello, Professor Sarin, let's just, how are things going or whatever. Could you introduce yourself? And I do not say anything throughout because at that point there was no name. And it took me, I have troubled my friends with over 50 options. And the one that stayed was this. And the underlying theme of this was all of us are travelers. Raahi, as in, travelers in many languages. All of us are travelers who are having journeys of impact, whether it is social or environmental, which you cannot get away from. And how do you navigate that journey of us? So, in many ways, it was also inspired by the point that you made, which is around everything that you do or do not has a social impact. So, that's where the name finally landed and stuck. And now I tell people that Raahi Impact is the brand under which Raahi Impact Journeys is the
Nice. Nice.
So thank you so much for helping kickstart the journey, and thank you so much for all the thoughts and bearing with tacky editing of your video in the early days.
No, thank you, and and again, welcome back.
Thank you, Professor. Okay.
Done?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay. Bye, everyone. So.